So we're here to solve this Sunday Stumper by Jinhoo An. It's a really creative variation of Statue Park that is using cages to mark some either or half and half splits. And one thing that you'll want to do at the start, while we won't exactly know which of these sets of groups are going to be shaded or unshaded, is we can mark off some edges which for sure are going to be crossed by different sets. And that's because, at least in these 1x2 boxes, they're going to always have to be different shapes. And as we start to mark them in, we'll see examples like here, where we've got 5 cells that are going to be part of one kind of group, and these 5 cells join next to this region, and one of these cells, not both of those cells, is going to be part of that shape. And so anytime we get one of these connected groups in a corner to look like it's 6 or larger, that's going to have to be white. And so we can mark in at this stage of the puzzle, in the lower right corner at least, some white cells, and mark in some shaded cells, and we'll come back to this region probably in a bit to keep doing this kind of work. Up in the top, we don't exactly know if this is white or shaded, but we'll probably be able to deduce that pretty soon by thinking about these adjoining groups. But let's start in this upper left corner now, which we haven't looked at yet. And a thing to note is that when we mark in these edges, as I've been doing with these X's, there's a pretty crucial cell, which is this cell, which is the only cell that's going to get something from this corner out into the grid. And that cell has to be white. If that cell weren't white, you'd have some white cells in the space, but they can't cross any of these boundaries. And knowing that this is white, we now still have to place some black shape in this area, and it's going to take a total of 5 of those cells. And if that's taking 5 cells, then white can only take a total of 4 remaining cells. And there's no cell where this is used and this is used that are both in white that are 4 apart. So a first thing we can mark is that that cell is for sure black. This is white. These will be 4 apart, but this will have to come in. However this goes, this cell gets shaded. These get marked up, and we have our first pentomino in the grid, which is our first P. These cells are going to be shaded over here. We should note right now that one thing we're going to see is that this white cell has to take one of these 2 cells as its next space, but it's not going to be able to take this diagonal cell to it for it to stay connected. Marking that in, we've got a group of size 3 near a group of size 2, but we couldn't take an extra cell to complete that, so we're going to make this shape, and we can mark some more places. Again, the whites are going to have to stay connected, the blacks are going to have to come through. We've now made our first L shape. This black is going to have to keep coming out. We have a place where this doesn't have another option for it except for this cell, and we actually get a second P pretty quickly in the grid, which will complete the use of that shape. So we'll keep a mental note that P is no longer a shape we can use. These white cells have to get out to stay connected, and that means that a cell like this can't be white because we can only get one more cell in this area to be white. So the efficient cell is the cell that's straight below. We get these cells coming down for another shape. It can be an I or an L, but whichever it is going to leave this unused. This shape has to keep extending, and that now puts this cell in, which puts this in, which gives us for sure this is an I, and we'll mark that in. We can now come to this lower left corner. We can do the same thing we did before, and here the way that this now has some resolution is to see that these 4 cells will always take a 5th cell, and that cell will be the last in this region that is of the same color or type as these 4. And so once we've actually marked this white cell by solving from the top down, we now know for sure this is shaded. If this were white and that were white, both of these cells are shaded, and that would be no good. So we have that these are both, all these are shaded. This, whatever last cell we take, will be the last in that region, but it will be touching to this cell, so this cell has to be white. So we get a group like this that's coming in, this comes down, this comes over. We have our second L in the grid, and so we can also now mark off in our shape that P and L are no longer usable. That'll help in some places, and one place I'm seeing that right now is that this pentomino has a lot of roots where it becomes an L, but it has some roots where it comes down here. And so there's a requirement probably that it takes some cell in this row. If it doesn't take any cell in this row, it's going to be an L. And some of the things that could force this to only take cells in this row would be, for instance, if this pentomino came like this and the whites had to come straight across, forcing an L. And so I think one way that seeing that an L isn't in the grid lets us limit stuff is by recognizing we got to take a cell here. We're going to have to take this cell in this shape. And that's now starting to form the look of an L, so that isn't used and this isn't used. And so the last cell here is going to be one of these two. But whichever of those it uses, if we took one of those two cells down here, let me just sort of draw it in quickly. If I took that cell, I'd have to take this cell and now isolated the space of the grid. So these two that I'm marking in white circles are for sure part of the path out of the space. Whichever of these gets used, we can't cross over if it's the F or the Z. And so I put these two in, but now I know I can't make an L. I put this in. This comes down, and I have a Z and an F for sure in the grid, which will be the first two of those types. I haven't looked at this G letter yet just for counts. I think all the large shapes, this is 12 large, this is also 12 large, this is 8 large. So we need to have 6 cells marked, and we have 6 cells marked. So the last two are unmarked. We can now probably make a little more headway in this corner, and it's going to be recognizing as we've been doing things that we have a shape that's going to be coming through here, and we have some white cells that are going to go out. And so let's start to think about some cells that are under some tension. And one of the cells that's probably under tension, anytime we mark one of the cells in a 2x2 box, will be the other cell in that 2x2 box. So let's imagine this were the same color. These are both white. Then this will be black, this will be black. These whites have to come out. So this will extend. And now we've got 4 cells. It's going to join to this one and cause an issue. And if we actually marked some more in, we'd see there's also an issue coming up here with connectivity. So the cell is under pressure, being this corner cell opposite this, has to be black. We now have some more cells below that we can be thinking about and trying to, again, identify where those could be under pressure. And one way to think about this is probably actually considering the connectivity in general. And a set of shapes that are probably going to be bad are going to be those that happen if we take, let's say there's going to be a top channel or a bottom channel. So let's do this first. Let's sort of force these white cells to have to take a straight route out. And if that were the case, I think what I'm forcing as my deduction are this cell is being used. This now is going to force either whites to be up top or whites to be below. If they're below, then I shade both of these, but I'm making another P shape, and P is in my list that I'm not using. If it's this other direction where it's this, I get these as the shapes. This comes out, and this keeps extending. And right now that looks okay. But my guess is if we can get a forced last shape in the grid to have 2 eyes, we have an issue. And so I haven't tracked back this start over to this corner, but this pentomino here was an L or an I. So right now I actually could mark in and should mark in that this is for sure an I and is the last I. And in doing that, I see that this kind of option down in the bottom is broken. And so that started from this cell, forcing all these in white to be limited. Being shaded was the key challenge. So we'll start with this cell being shaded and this being unshaded. And now we again have a situation where we have some cells that are under stress. Here's a cell that's under stress. Let's say this were black. If it were black, it can come over here and form another L, but that's no good. We have 2 in the grid already. Or it can come down here, but then the rest of these cells in the shape are going to be white, and so that won't form a pentomino. And so this cell is under stress, which means that we can't, for instance, make this one to be white. Again, the diagonal one is pretty forcing. So this is shaded. These can't all be shaded because that would be a third eye. So we get this in the grid. Now we can come up 1, but we always have to come over 1 because we can't join into the space. and I can't form an I can't form an L, so I must form a Y. So we'll mark the Y in. We're going to have this coming through, this coming out, these coming over. These whites still need to get out, so I've got to put this in, which forces and finalizes these cells. So we've got a V in the grid, which is our first V, and we're going to have this pentomino coming across. And I think this is good headway on the left, and my guess is I need to actually look more on the right to break in further. There's only limited constraints from these large regions, and my guess is I need to have some shape constraints to get further. So let's start to consider either of these spaces and some of the constraints that are going to be important around them. One thing I think is going to be true is that there's going to be some challenges with getting in and out of the space if we're not cautious about the shape of this pentomino. And some of the ways that this pentomino can take its cells would limit off these shapes. So sort of these boundaries look somewhat constrained because they're going to be touching multiple cells, and this looks somewhat constrained. So let's think about how we could cause different issues. And I'm looking back at things I already know for sure, like a P isn't in the grid. And one thing a P not being in the grid forces is an edge like this. One of these has to be white. If they were both shaded, I'm forming a P shape. Hopefully you see that. And so let's consider which of these sides of this option. They could actually both be white, but I think we can also quickly show that's an issue. We would then be shading these, and we'd have 4 that are going to be merging in to make a 6 or something. So this is actually a case where it's something I could be marking as an either or, which I guess in my notation might be something like that. If we shade this cell, we're going to shade this as white and this is white, but now we've marked these in and shade this as white, this is white, this is white, and now like we've cramped in the space, and we actually, if we marked all the ones we know in black, we both don't form a pentomino and we don't have a way out of the grid. And so knowing that we have a pretty constrained set of cells here, the main issue is putting the white path in this cell that has to come out and around and can't get all the way around. And so this is a forced shade, this is a forced unshade. We have some possibilities for what shape this goes to look like. I think this is forced to always be a U. One thing that we can do, at least at this stage, is know that we're not shading both of these cells. So at most I can come up here and then come over, or I could come here and come over, or there is what looks to be a V shape. But the V shape would actually mark this is unused and that is unused, and then this 4-cell region would not have enough in it. So this is always a U. And let's see if we can think about which specific U, if that's forced right now at this stage in the grid. There's this U, actually both of the U's will mark this cell as white. The one that looks like this is going to take these off and this off and then shade in that cell. The one that looks like this is going to mark both of these white. This is white. This is white. This is white. Again, make that. I think in all cases this cell is shaded, or sorry, it's always shaded or it's always unshaded. Actually, this is still an either or. This can be both modes. I think this is a cell that's always unshaded. So we'll put that in the grid. We may want to come back to here. My guess is a shape constraint may help us. So let's look at the top. And in the top, we have the start of what could be an L in black, but L is now no longer a good shape. So where we didn't come to this at the start, we can come to it now and say that these cells are for sure white. So this is black. These are black. Now, one of the things that looks like it's going to be somewhat limiting is how we take cells from this region to finish out a shape. And one thing that looks important to mark here are, again, along the lines of things I've been doing before, knowing that I can't have a P in the grid. I'm not taking both of these cells or both of those cells, so I can only have at most one of these being shaded. And if I actually take this center cell, if this came like this, it would have to keep going. And now I mark 1, 2, 3 as unshaded in this region. So for sure, this cell is white. And now we can ask ourselves, do we take a U shape? And if we take a U shape, we're going to have this white extending 1, 2, 3. Like if I put this into the grid, we would have 1, 2, 3 marked as white in this space, and that's also no good. And so now we have a case where we use only one of these two cells, but this cell is always shaded. And now we have to think about which is a better scenario, this coming in and taking one of these cells, or this coming out and finishing a V, marking this. And note that in both scenarios, this cell is white. So, and the reason for that, again, if I take this cell, this has to extend out, and if I take this cell, this is next to a finished pentomino. And so I have two more blacks to place, but let's say I don't use this cell, I get a fourth black and a fifth black from this pentomino shape, but I would put two more whites in this grid. And so for this to take two black cells, we can't also connect into this cell with a pentomino. We must connect through the top as a pentomino, and that puts in a V. And that looks to be the second V in the grid, so we can put V in our no longer usable category. That would have actually helped down here, aside from how we logic that this was U. And I actually didn't mark that we conceptually know the U from here. I'll put that in now. We have some more we can start to do though in the space. Some of the things to note are that this cell here can't be white, because then if both of these are shaded, we've isolated things. So this is always black. And that means because we don't have a P, this is white. These don't connect as edges. With this coming through, this is a distinct pentomino from these three cells. And that means where it's going to take two cells in this region, if it connected through this cell, it would get too large. So it always connects from down below. And that's 1, 2, 3, 4. This will take the fifth cell here. And it's not an L because that's above, so this is a Y. This is going to be the second Y. So we'll put that in as another finished shape. Does that help us any way up here? Well, one thing we know for sure is if this is taking another cell here, it's not taking two more to join to this shape. So these are broken. I think there may be something about what shape can be forced here tied to how we'll isolate the grid. So let's come back to that in a second. And maybe let's just see how we continue to extend up here into this space. And I guess one first thing to note is that with these pentominoes connecting, there's now a fair amount of constraint over here. Notice that we can't put another pentomino in like this space. The only actual option would be another P shape, but we have a P in the grid. So the only cells that can be reachable along the top are those that can extend and connect into this. So we have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. So this cell is reachable. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. That's reachable. These cells are not. And I now have a case where 2 of the 6 cells in this area are marked as white. So I have to start putting in cells that if I didn't shade would cause issue. So these look like that. I have 1, 2, 3, 4, so I take one more here. So this is going to be a black or white. This is always black. And that now actually puts in another situation where we could form a P, so I've got to avoid that P. Looks like we've been using that kind of logic a lot. Where we have this and this is the either or cells. These remaining ones are always white, and I'm seeing a couple shapes that can form. If this cell is black, then this one must be white and that one must be black, and that's to avoid a P. So one of the versions of this shape is a U, and the other version where this is black comes like this, and it can't be an L, it can be an N. So this is an N or a U, but we don't know which. And that will probably help us out a bit. Coming back to this side where this is starting like this, if I come down here, we can't form a V, so let me mark that edge from being fully shaded across. And that means this looks like it could be taking on an N shape or a T shape. And these are more subtle things to mark into the grid, but they do seem to be somewhat important to track. I think I'm now coming back to needing to think about this shape, and actually I missed this earlier, but there's a pretty easy reason why this U is bad, and the reason this U is bad is once this cell is white, the cell also becomes black, and I have to overgrow the shape of the overall U. So what I should have gotten earlier, but what I'm seeing again here, is that I can mark this in as a sure U. These cells coming up work, and these cells come out and across. These come in together. This comes in here. I always take this. I don't have another V to take, so that cell is no good. I don't have another Y to make, so actually I can mark this edge and this edge off, which actually means these three shapes never reach into the P, so they're kind of taking like an F or an X shape. But what they'll end up doing is marking some of the cells in white around here, so there's going to be a somewhat constrained space within this grid to work off of, and that will be something we'll want to note. I think I'm going to try to come into the center of the grid now through here along the bottom, and also be thinking about some of the shapes that we have more constrained. I guess I can mark this, then now we have an NU over here. So it looks like where we've got one U left and then like an NU up here, we either have both N's here with a remaining U, or we've got a U with an N, and like N is starting to get constrained. So there's some considerations we can be making towards that light that will probably be useful. And one thing to see is that there is an option to come all the way down here and take both of these cells to finish out this shape, and that would mark these as all white, and then this cell coming up, but that would put an N to the grid, which would be the last N in the grid, because we only have 1, 2, 3 that are in the U or UN category. There's really one N left to place. And it could be that another thing to think through right now is just how many pentominoes we have. We have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13, 14, 15, 16, 17, 18, 19, 20 distinct shapes. And we're going to need to have another pentomino roughly here to connect into this group. We're going to need, where I said this doesn't have any connection into this P, this is a 22nd pentomino, and then at most, if I take one cell from this and 2 from here, I get maybe one more cell here, so I have like 6 to fill in this space, and I don't have any pentomino shapes left. I guess I could put in a U here, but in practice it looks like 23 and 24 are 2 shapes that will add a total of 6 cells into this M, which means that there's not a lot to reach down here and shade. Like maybe one of these takes 2 cells and takes another cell here, but I've got to get some shading from these pentominoes to put some good stuff in the grid. And in the way I mark these cells as off, I can mark this as off for the same reason. There's not a V that's coming in, so this is a T or an N. And now actually that this is a TN and that's a TN, that looks quite interesting, that now I actually have 2 T's in the grid, or I have the last N and a single T, so I now again have just 1 degree of freedom, which is a T or an N degree of freedom. Or maybe even, I guess I have a U degree of freedom. But NU or T, there's only one more of those to place in shapes that I haven't yet filled in. Let's come back to things we've done. Like on the top, we said some of these cells were limited. Let's think about what cells here can actually be reached or not be reached. This cell can't be part of a pentomino. The only thing for it would be this P shape because it can't join to this or this. And actually it also can't be a distinct pentomino because we really have 24 already in the grid, so everything's going to have to reach into these shapes if they're used. If this cell is taken, it's going to have to connect over to this, but that isolates these. If this cell is used by this, that finishes out all the other parts of this group, so this would form a V, so this is a sure unused, which may help us a bit. I guess one thing that's probably going to be helpful is seeing, I was talking about some of this with this shape coming in and actually like marking off a fair number of white cells. If it's this F shape, it marks off 1, 2, 3. If it's this F shape, it marks off 1, 2, 3. And the most forcing form is actually going to be if this N came up. And so often you like look at what's going to force a lot of things quickly, and what that forces quickly is this top F shape, which forces this into the grid, But now this P has to put in a pentomino, and it's going to come here, and you should be able to see that all of this white is constrained and limited, can't connect anywhere else in the grid. And so this is a very constraining place and actually breaks the puzzle. And with some of that intuition coming in, this is a U. And so we actually complete our U, which means this is not a U, this is an N. I'll put that in. One thing I'm noting is that this P, like again, we're going to have some like unused cells around here. One thing that's probably pretty bad for it is if this pentomino also comes in and crushes steps around it. So think about this pentomino now. Right now it's taking one of these cells and it's taking one of those cells. And in the case where it takes this cell, it's not going to be able to form a Y, so it's going to take this cell. So the constrained position is this one, and that puts in a T. And for these whites to stay connected, these come in, and now I'm getting these cells marked through. So it means I have to actually put this and this as the only cells I can take, and I'm forced to make an X, but now I'm also forced to, in filling in the remaining blacks, isolate this cell right here. And so all of this is through cells under tension, and I can see some of this just in my head, but for this video I'm trying to put some of it on paper, so I'm just sketching these out, but this cell is not part of a shape. So this cell is, which means this is not used because it would form a P, so instead we form an F, and that's our second F. We'll mark the F shape through in the grid. We really don't have too many kinds of shapes left to go, but we just put in the second F, so we were already talking in the space about an F or an X, so this is now actually space we can work much more quickly from. So we'll mark that first X in the grid. We have to fill in 4 cells in this space as black, and one of these is remaining white. So they're going to be, I guess, a limited number of ways the remaining cells go. Let's sort of, again, like start by thinking about the more constraining spots and how they'll stay connected. And some of the constraining spots would be things like having a white here would put a black here, which would go further out. So I think like this cell must always be shaded. If there's a white here, this is going to come in and force an N. So as soon as we actually limit the position of the last N in the grid, that will be pretty quick to help us. Let's trying to see if there's something worse. If this is white, then we have to avoid the P, so we put in this shape. That's got to come out here and avoid this. That's possible to work, but is somewhat constrained. So there are some limits around this shape that are looking to be key right now and where we're working through the puzzle. I think, though, there's more we can do in the bottom now tied to the shape. And the reason I say that is thinking about some cells around this. So let's just start looking at this shape and recognizing it's not going to be able to be a P or U, so it's got to reach out to a larger box. And actually I have the Y's in the grid, I have the L's in the grid, I have the I's in the grid. So this could be an N and come up to here, or otherwise it's always taking this cell. So let's start to sketch out some paths of how this can look and figure out if that helps us get some intuition about things. One thing is if this takes all of these to become an N, then these are white, and so this comes straight up. And it can't go up anymore because we have used the L, the I, and the Y, so it must come over here. But it can't take this cell, that would form a V. We've got those in the grid, and if this is the last N, taking this cell would be another N. And so this is not possible to take both of those. So we have to take one of these up above, and this is forced white. That means we always take one of the cells down here, maybe both of the cells. Let's say we take both of the cells. We take both of the cells so that these are both black. Because we're avoiding a P shape, this has to be taken. This then is not used and not used because the U and the L are in the grid, so this comes in, this would be a Z, which would be possible. We've got one more to go, but note that we've actually taken 1, 2, 3 in this shape, so this isn't takeable. We'd have to take this cell, and now these all come together. So we're slowly making headway here, but the next set of deductions we can delete is that we can't take both of these cells, so we have to take one more from this side, which finishes a T shape, and we take one of these, not both of these. I'll mark in the first T. If we take one of these, not both of these, we always take this cell. And if we take this bottom cell, 1, 2, 3, we come here for 4, this would be a U or an L. Both of those are fully in the grid. I didn't actually mark the U up yet, but that's in our exclude list, so this isn't acceptable. If I don't take this cell, I come up here and form a Y, so I always take this cell. And that now gives me a case where I'm going to have a Y or a W, a W or an N as the last shape. And we're going to be in a case where we have, I think, a closure issue here. If this is a W, then this cell isn't taken, but I have to shade this in to get 3 in this half and half region. But if this comes in and this gets shaded like this, where do these whites extend out? And I don't see any space for them. And so this has to be an N and not that W. And in doing that, I've now placed the last N. And placing the last N, I now know for sure this has to be a T. This is one of the points of tension we had in the grid. I've got the last N and T. I have 2 W's, an X, and a Z to place, and I've got these 3 pentominoes. And there could have been even more. I don't know if there was an easier way through seeing 23 and 24 had to be above to actually get the most efficient packing of these to use all these cells and get 6 shaded. But my guess is a path for what may look like more direct logic, not just some of what I'm doing in my solve, would be to use that pentomino count down here. But I was using it through exclusions and excluding the N's and T's and U's and V's and so forth. I got to this shape. So we've got to place a W, an X, and a Z into this space, and all of those are 3 by 3 shapes, and I've got to place 6 cells in this area somehow as shaded, and there's only one scenario I see where I can get more than 3 cells from one pentomino in this space. Like a lot of them, like say I have a W, say actually this W could put in 4. I guess I have some options. I also have this X. But some are going to be more limited, and this looks like a particularly limited shape, particularly if I use this cell. If I use this cell, the W is no good, and X is no good, and the Z is like this. So this cell is not used, and that means 1, 2, 3, 4. These 2 cells are always used. This would form a P. So this comes in. This is now only the Z shape and the last Z shape in the grid. So now I have 2 W's and an X, our normal friend the X coming in. While there is a single W here, it will take 1 cell, and I can't put an X to take 5 more in this shape, so this isn't going to be a good place for it. By the time I'm here, I don't have any valid shapes, so these are all unused. We can think a little bit about what comes in and fills this region and which cells must be filled in. We'll note that it's probably coming from just a single pentomino of what it does. So let's again look at how do we take 4 cells now with any of these shapes. So now I think I'm at a stage where the only way I take 4 cells in this region from a single pentomino, leaving 2 for the other, is if an X is here. And if an X is here, I form a lot of issues up here that aren't going to work. So I think I have a case where I know for sure I'm doing a 3 and 3 split of the cells in this shape. And a 3 and 3 split, if they were both having to be through the W, would sort of be chunking around this zone too much. So I think for sure the W's can't both take 3 and 3, so the X has to be one of the ones that's taking 3, and the X that can take 3, there's an option here. Just marking the center cell. This we said was no good. This is no good. I could take this I'll, I guess, use this notation instead. This is not good. This would be fine. So we've got 3 kinds of spots for it. Let's start to then think about how for 21 up here we get 3 cells taken. Again, we have 2 whites, so we're going to take 3 black and 1 white remaining, and this will be taken by a W. And if it's taken by a W, only 2 of these in this row are taken. For sure I take this cell, for sure I take this cell, and for sure I take this cell, so this is coming in as a diagonal. And that is never used. That's going to actually eliminate one of my X positions quickly, and I actually think in practice it's going to eliminate this X position quickly because I have to get a W down here to take 3 more. And I now have, for it to work off a W, it can't only be in one column, so knowing these cells aren't used. The W is going to have to come over here, and it's always going to take one of these corner positions. If it took this, it would come up like this. That doesn't look good. If it takes this, it can take this, which takes this. Again, the W is off of that diagonal. So these aren't marked. I could take this cell or that cell, depending on which way it goes, but I'm going to be having an issue if I form too narrow a channel here. For instance, this shape isolates this cell. So this W has to deflect up and to the left. And this W has to deflect down and to the right. And that looks like a very valid path, finishes that shape with the right number of cells. This comes in, nothing white is shaded. I'm now down to just this one X position. And I think we're through the Sunday Stumper. It's a really, really tough puzzle and used a whole variety of Statue Park rules, but if you got your way through it, congrats. And if not, hopefully some of the things I was describing in this video will help you see ways to track notes, ways to see points of tension in this kind of variation of this puzzle, sort of cells. You know, once we had a shape that had to come into another row, we could start to force things around it. We were dodging L's, so we needed to come into the space, Ultimately, we needed to have, you know, enough room to get a channel in between, and that's what forced an FC. We had different situations where you had like this N or U option, but it would force different structure here into this space. Similarly, this Y coming down versus what ended up being F coming in, sort of tension in that space. And a lot of sort of the real start of like just seeing where we wouldn't know what started white or black, we could start to put in some shapes, and different parts of the grid flew back into solving there. Like these 2 L's mean this eventually had to be white and not black, although we didn't know anything in that corner. Some sort of other groups here, like sort of how to fill this, came through. So lots of different pockets of aha moments, or at least sticking points if you didn't have the moment of inspiration. But really, really great Sunday Stumper, really impressive construction from Jin Huan, and we'll see you again soon.